Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Joe Swimmer, I'm the Executive Director of the Episcopal Parish Network. And I just wanted to welcome you all and thank you for being with us to one of our best subscribed digital workshops yet. Over 550 folks have subscribed to join this. This will be recorded, and if someone wasn't able to join us live, we'll be sending out a link to that recording probably tomorrow morning. But we are grateful to our partners at Church Investment Group, to Joanne, who assisted us with putting this program together, to Susie, who will be helping to moderate, and of course to Katharine for joining us. If you are not a member of Episcopal Parish Network, if your parish or cathedral is not a member yet, we invite you to learn about membership through the link that will be posted in the chat in just a minute. You help to make these programs possible. So we are so grateful to Church Investment Group, to Joanne for putting this together, and we welcome Susie and Katharine. And Joanne, off to you. Thanks so much.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. We are very excited to have Katharine share with us her perspectives on and her expertise on climate. I'm Joanne Hansen. I'm the president of the Church Investment Group. We're a nonprofit that works and partners with Episcopal endowments to assemble and create a broad asset allocation that uses environmental social governance characteristics for its construction. And I'm joined with my co-moderator, Susie Ferreira, who is a policy analyst at the Episcopal Church's Office of Government Relations. And obviously, the woman of the day is Katharine Hayhoe, who is an atmospheric scientist, and among her many roles and accomplishments, she's the chief scientist of the Nature Conservancy. She's a professor at Texas Tech in public policy, law, and health. She's the author of the best-selling book, Saving Us, and she's on the board of the Evangelical Environmental Network. And we have a chat, as Joe was saying, a chat feature at the bottom, and we want to make this interactive. So Katharine is going to talk to us for about 30 minutes or so, give us a sense of her book, Saving Us, and then Susie and I will ask a few questions, and we will follow through the chat and ask your questions. And so with that, I'm thrilled to turn it over to Katharine.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction. I'm so pleased to be with you here today. Recorded, so you can join as we go along, or you can also share this later. And I see that people are putting in the chat where they are joining us from, which is fantastic. So what I'm going to do is I wanted to speak to you for a little bit on the topics that I look at, which are climate change and how we respond to it. So I will go ahead and share my screen here, just a second. And when I ask people, often when I'm beginning a presentation, I ask people, how do you feel about climate change in one word? Because I'm curious, how do people feel about this issue? And often what I get is something like this. Most people feel worried, anxious, scared, concerned. Some feel sad and depressed. Others feel angry and frustrated. Some are overwhelmed or even terrified. So if you feel this way, you are not alone. That is, in fact, how almost everyone I speak with feels. And the few who say they aren't are likely just suppressing it. If you feel this way, if you recognize yourself in any of these words, you are not alone, and what you are feeling is a very rational response to what's happening to our planet. When we look back in the history of this planet, we can see that we're conducting a truly unprecedented experiment with the only home that we have. As far back as we can go in the history of this planet, we've never seen this much carbon going into the atmosphere this quickly. And we know why it's happening. It's because, beginning about 300 years ago, we started to dig up more and more coal back then, and gas and oil today, and burn it, producing heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm. That is literally what is happening to our planet. 75% of that blanket comes from burning fossil fuels, and 25% of it comes from deforestation and large-scale industrial agriculture. And just as you would if someone snuck into your room and put an extra blanket on you at night when you were sleeping, just as you would, you'd wake up sweating saying, hey, I didn't need this extra blanket. That's what's happening to our planet. Now, how long have we known about this? We've known about this for a really long time. These are the real pictures of the real scientists who connected coal mining, burning coal, heat trapping gases, and the temperature of the planet. In fact, by the 1890s, we knew enough about it that a Swedish chemist called Svante Arrhenius was able to calculate how much the planet would warm if we doubled or tripled levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And by the 1930s, we had already seen so much change that British engineer Guy Callender was able to collect temperature data from around the world from the last 50 years and show that the planet was warming due to burning fossil fuels. He wrote that paper in 1937. So you might say, well, then what's new today? Why do we still have climate scientists? Well, over the last 100 years, we've been doing a lot. One of the things we've been doing is making sure that there's no natural causes for the changes we've seen. And so we look at the sun, we look at natural cycles, we look at volcanoes, we say, could it be these factors causing us to get warmer? And when we look at every single one of these, we see that according to natural factors, the sun, natural cycles, and volcanic eruptions, we should be getting cooler, not warmer. We know, and this is truly a scientific number, we are 99.9999% sure, and scientists don't get any more sure than that not only is this real, and not only is it human caused, but it is very serious. Today, we see that temperature is changing faster than any time in the history of human civilization on this planet, and that's why it matters. It is not about saving the planet. The planet will be orbiting the sun long after we're gone. It's about us living things that are perfectly adapted for the conditions we've had. But now those are changing faster than we've ever seen. And the biggest way they're affecting us is not through what we often refer to as global warming, which is the increase in the average temperature of the whole planet, but rather what I refer to as global weirding. In other words, wherever we live, conditions are just getting weird. Droughts are more intense, heat waves are more dangerous, wildfires are burning more area, hurricanes are much stronger and they're dumping more rain. Back in the 1980s, when NOAA, not Noah's Ark, but the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, back in the 1980s, when NOAA first started to collect and document billion-dollar weather and climate disasters, there was one of those happening on average every 4 months in the United States. Today, there is one happening every 3 weeks or less. That is how climate change is loading the weather dice against us. So we see the headlines. We see the headlines of flooding in Pakistan or New York City, extreme heat or drought in Europe or California. And what's new today is that we can put numbers on how much worse climate change is making it. 7 times more likely were the deadly floods in Germany 2 years ago. The Pacific Northwest heat wave that happened a year ago last summer, 150 times more likely. Climate change affects all of us, but it doesn't affect us all equally. It affects the poor and the marginalized most, whether we're talking about the biggest cities right here in the United States or the other side of the world. And that is not fair. And that's where we start to connect our head to our hearts. Because the science can tell us who is responsible, but when we look at that information, it evokes a very different response than just cold, objective scientific facts. It evokes a response from our hearts. When we realize that the poorest 50% of people in the entire world are only responsible for 7% of this extra blanket that we're wrapping around the planet. And then if you flip it and you look at the impacts, which countries are impacted the most by how climate change is loading the weather dice against us? People who live in Malawi, Somalia, Mozambique, Sudan, which, as you know, is in the headlines today for the internal political conflict, Madagascar, Liberia. Most of the countries who are most vulnerable to climate impacts are the countries that have done the least to contribute to the problem. And we know that over the last 50 years, 60 years actually, climate change has already increased the economic gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world. And of course, COVID exacerbated that as well. So not only as a scientist, but as a Christian, I ask myself, what is climate change other than a failure to love? What is it other than failing to acknowledge the truth of what God's creation is telling us and the impact of those changes on many who have done nothing to contribute to the problem? That includes people alive today, it includes future generations, and it includes what we often think of as God's creation, nature, which we have been given responsibility over. So in Genesis 1, there's a verse that many people are familiar with. You often learn about it in Sunday school, where it says, God said, let us make human beings in our image, reflecting our nature. But what I didn't realize until I was long past Sunday school was that there was a so that there. There was a reason why humans were made in God's image. And do you know what that so that is? So that we can, and I'm deliberately using the Hebrew word here because this has been translated to English in various ways, so that we can rada every living thing that moves on the face of the earth. Now, this has been translated as take responsibility over, and it has also been translated as have dominion over. But rather than translating this word, let's just look at other places in the Bible where the same word is used in context. So taking the same word, you can go to the Psalms, and it uses this word to speak of God ruling from sea to sea in order to what? In order to deliver the needy and the afflicted and him who has no helper, to have compassion on the poor and needy, and the lives of the needy he will save. So it is crystal clear from the context of this word here and many other places in the Bible that there is a clear taking care of those who need assistance and help. That is why we were created in God's image. And again, it's not just us, plants, animals, humans, we are all living things. And in Genesis 1, it says, so that we can rada every living thing on this earth. And that means all of us. So often, and this is a diagram that has been amended by Dave Bookless, who is a theology director for Arasha, a Christian conservation organization that you might know of, and if you don't, I highly recommend them. Often, we think of humans as standing on top of the pyramid. And this leads to a very egocentric perspective where we would use nature for our own benefit. An alternate perspective is to view us as just one of many, but that does not emphasize our God-given role. Rather, what if we think of it like this? That we have a role not to stand on top of, but to serve, to protect, to take responsibility over, to care for every living thing, including our sisters and our brothers who share this incredible planet with us. So caring about what happens to this world and all living things in it is not antithetical to who we are. I often hear, and I think I just heard from somebody yesterday saying, well, you're just talking about worshiping the creation instead of the creator. And my response to that is, haven't you read the Bible? Because in Genesis 1, it literally says the creator has given us this responsibility to care for this physical world. It's who we were made to be, and it's why we were created in God's image. So no, caring about what happens to this world is entirely consistent with who we are and with who God has made us. In Ephesians, Paul talks about love and says, walk in love as we were loved and as Christ gave up his life for us. So my question is, when we approach climate action from a perspective of love, what does that look like? There's also the Texas version of the same verse. I live in Texas where they often put the Bible on road signs. Don't necessarily agree with all the translations, but I think this is a good one. That love thy neighbor thing, I meant it, signed God. So where do we begin? What does this look like? What do we do? We need action today more than ever, but how do we begin? This is a question that I've been asking myself for years. And during the first year of the pandemic, I sat down and I wrote a book about it. That's the book, Saving Us. And what I discovered by looking at theology, by looking at psychology, by looking at the theories of social change and the way the world has changed before, how women got the vote, how slavery ended, how civil rights were enacted, how apartheid ended. All of those had something in common. They engaged people. So where do we begin with this action? Now, all too often, we begin here. We assume that if people aren't talking about it, it's because they aren't worried. So we think, well, here's me and everybody I know, we're worried. But then all these people who don't want to talk about it, they're not worried. And if people aren't worried, what do we need to do? We need to make them worried, right? Because nobody wants to act if they don't think there's a problem. That just makes sense. So we need to say there is a problem in order for people to act. So if this is the case, what we do is climate changes and we get worried. So we load up on all of the scary facts about polar bears and ice sheets and future projections and global temperature and ocean heat. And we share the most scary data we can. But the result we get is not what we were intending 9 times out of 10. 9 times out of 10, people just pull the covers over their head and reject it even more. Why is that? It's because of the way our brains are wired. Tali Sherrod is a neuroscientist. She wrote a really good book called The Influential Mind. And in it she explains, and she's not talking about climate change, she's just talking about the way our brain works. She says, fear and anxiety cause us to withdraw, to freeze, to give up rather than take action if we don't know what to do. And that's where most people are. When we actually look at where people are, we see that most people agree that global warming is happening. Most people, about the same number, are worried about global warming. This is a map from the Yale Program of Climate Communication. It asks people across the whole country by county, is it real? And any county that's orange, more than 50% of people said yes, and the darker orange, the more people say yes. When you ask people, are you worried? The map looks almost identical. So most people are, in fact, aware that it's real and worried. But then the researchers asked them another question. They said, do you think it will affect you? And the map looks very different. Why does it look so different? This is something called psychological distance. We don't think it will affect me here and now. We still think of it as a future or distant issue. So the real picture, if we look at the survey data, is not that me and a few people I know are worried and nobody else is. Actually, most people are worried. There's a very small group of dismissives who claim they're not worried, but I actually think they are underneath. They're just pushing it down really aggressively. And then there's a very small group that are activated. In fact, the activated and the not worried, both of them are about 10% of the population. So we've got 10% over here who claim they're not worried, and it's not real and it's not a big deal. And then we've got about 10% over here who are activated, but most people are right in the middle. They're worried but not activated. So if people are worried but not activated, is more information about polar bears and ice sheets and future global temperature projections, is that going to activate them? If they're already worried and they haven't been activated, no. In fact, what it often will do is it will paralyze them. The real problems we have are not awareness that it's real and it's serious. The two problems we have are that we don't understand how it affects me. We know up here in our heads it's bad, but we haven't connected our heads to our hearts. How does it affect the places I love, the people I love, the things I love today? We haven't made that head-heart connection. But then the other connection we haven't made is to our hands. If I'm worried about this, what can I do to make a difference? So in our conversations, we don't have to make most people more worried. What we have to do is we have to help them connect their head to their heart and connect their heart to their hands. And I believe as people of faith that we are ideally suited to do that, because isn't that what our faith is about in a nutshell? So I left off here with the people who don't think it affects them personally. But there's one more map that's darker blue that helps us figure out where to get started on this. Like, what do I do? You know, I've already changed my light bulbs. I already have a plug-in car. We already do, zero waste potlucks at church. What am I supposed to do? The answer, I believe, is in the next figure. They then ask people, do you ever talk about it? And the answer was pretty much no. Now, this is such a simple step that we just often skip right over it. Talking, who needs talking? We need action. We just skip right over the very first step. Now, I'm not talking about talking to Uncle Joe, who posts on Facebook every day how those climate scientists don't agree that it's real and they're all making it up for the money, or the people who write into the comment section of the local newspaper. The 8% dismissives cannot be convinced by anything other than a miracle. And I personally am not in the miracle business, but I believe one or two might have happened that I might have seen, but I had nothing to do with them. So I'm not talking about having a conversation with the first person who jumps to mind. I'm talking about having a conversation with everybody else in the middle who might be concerned or cautious or disengaged or even a bit doubtful or alarmed but not activated. Because remember, less than 10% of people are activated. That means that, probably 15, 16, 17% of alarmed people are not even activated. Why? They're alarmed up here. They haven't connected it to the heart and the hands. So why is talking so important? I have a colleague, George Marshall, from a great organization called Climate Outreach, who puts it so eloquently, I'm just going to quote him. Talk is the fertile field in which cultural change begins. In its absence, it's impossible for a group of people to solve a problem. Conversations underpin all climate action. How do you know, where to invest your money or where to divest, what party to vote for, what energy source to use at home? All these actions begin with simply opening your mouth and having a conversation about it. Talking knocks over the first domino. And yes, you can knock over the dominoes one by one, but it's a lot easier if you knock over the first one. And that's the power of conversations. He goes on and says, having conversations about climate change in our daily life plays a huge role in creating social change. Because we as humans, we have our antenna up all the time, and we're always taking our cues from what's important, from what we hear from our family, our friends, people at church, our neighbors. But the goal of our conversations is not, again, to load up on all the scary facts and hit people over the head with them. The goal is not to even tell people, but rather to bring them in and expand the conversation. Because if we don't talk about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we do anything about it? So climate changes and we get worried. Remember, we looked at this before. Here's where we break the cycle by doing what? By sharing head to heart, heart to hands. By sharing how it affects us here and now in ways that directly matter to me, and what positive, constructive solutions look like that others are doing or that we could do too. I was in Iowa a little while ago virtually, and somebody said, okay, that's fine, but you haven't explained how to tell people about polar bears. I said, well, unless there's a secret population of polar bears in Iowa that I don't know about, that is not what you want to be telling people about. Now, of course, if someone is already passionate about polar bears already, then definitely tell them about the polar bears. They are being endangered by the thawing ice from which they obtain their food source. So if they are already passionate about polar bears, then yes, that's what you do want to talk about. But if they're not, you need to talk about what they care about. And when you do that, then people are like, oh, so it matters to me because I'm a parent and it matters to my child. And that's a big part of my identity. And here's something I can do about it. That's when action results, because that's the way our brains are wired. To go back to the neuroscience, the human brain is built to associate forward action with a reward, not with avoiding harm. So reframe what you say. And again, this is not a book about climate change I'm quoting, but of course this is all about climate change. Reframe what you say so the information you provide induces what? Hope, not dread. So what if we begin our conversations not with the latest scary facts and not with what we think people should be worried about, but they're not? What if we begin with something we have in common? Like what? Well, climate change is certainly affecting the food we eat, and we all need food. It's affecting the water we drink, and we all need water. It's affecting the air we breathe. Burning fossil fuels produces so much air pollution, it's responsible for over 10 million premature deaths a year around the world. It's affecting the buildings and the roads and the systems we use. It's affecting the nature that surrounds us. What if we began with what we had in common, the fact that we all want a livable world with clean air, clean water, ample food, a safe place to live, beautiful places to go and take our children and our grandchildren? What if we connected over the fact that climate change affects our economy or our infrastructure or our energy, our water, our natural resources, or our health, our food or biodiversity or political conflict? Like I mentioned, Sudan is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate impacts. What if we brought up the facts that climate change is an issue of justice and equity? The very ones that we are asked to care for are being most impacted by a changing climate. What if we started with something that people already care about? Because to care about climate change, we don't have to be a certain type of person or vote a certain way or live a certain place. We just have to be a human being who depends on this incredible planet for everything. Absolutely everything. And we're all that, right? So begin with something we have in common. Bond over something that we share. Connect the dots to how climate change affects it. Let me give you a couple of examples, and then if you can, put in the chat, you tell me, what would your examples be? So often I connect with people over the fact that I'm a scientist and they might be really interested in science, so we can connect over science. But I also connect with people over the fact that I'm from Canada. We can talk about what's happening in Canada. I live in Texas, the most vulnerable state in the country to these global weirding climate extremes. I can definitely talk about that with people in Texas. I love skiing and you need snow to ski, so I talk with people who enjoy winter sports. I'm a mom, and I would do anything for a better future for my child, so I talk to other parents or grandparents or aunts or uncles who feel the same. I'm a Christian, so I speak with people who share my faith about how I believe that if we take the Bible seriously, we'll be at the front of the line demanding climate action. I've started conversations with people over a shared love of beach vacations, of chocolate. It's being affected by climate change too, as is coffee. I've started conversations over how we both enjoy knitting. And you can knit the warming striped scarf and it's a great conversation starter. So who are you? Are you a gardener? Are you a parent? Are you a business person? Have you been in the military? Are you a person of faith? Who are you that makes you the perfect person to care about climate change? Your answers should be all different. The point is, whoever we are, we're the perfect person already. And if we can help somebody else figure out how they're the perfect person, they don't have to change who they are. They don't have to become who I am to care about climate change. Imagine if everybody had to become a climate scientist to care about climate change. That makes no sense. Rather, we have to show them that who they are already is the perfect person to care. So begin our conversation with something we have in common. If we don't know what that is, ask about them first. Remember, bringing people into the conversation, not talking at them. Connect the dots to how climate change is affecting something we both care about. Whether it's fishing or skiing or birding or walking your dog or playing hockey outside or caring for the poor or issues of social justice or equity or healthy economy or national security. Connect the dots and then inspire them with positive, constructive solutions. This is the missing piece that brings hope. And I believe this is entirely consistent with what we believe too. In Timothy, Apostle Paul writes to Timothy and says, God has not given us a spirit of fear. It's a litmus test for us as Christians that what God has given us is not fear, but power, an old-fashioned word that simply means now today empowered. We're able to act instead of being paralyzed, of love and of a sound mind to make good decisions. So how do we put this into practice when we talk about solutions? Well, people want solutions that give us a better life and a better world, not a worse one. But they don't think that what they do can make a difference. So how can we show people that we can make a difference? The best way, in my opinion, is by giving examples. Examples of action, because to quote someone else, who you may have heard of, Greta Thunberg, the one thing we need more than hope today is action. Once we start to act, hope is everywhere. So when I share with people, I share what is already happening. I share how we can act out of love to care for those most affected by drought, flood, famine, and illness. I share how clean energy is revolutionizing the lives of people around the world who live in energy poverty. I share how churches are acting wisely and in community to do energy audits of their buildings to save money, to save energy, to save carbon emissions, and to enable them to help people. I share solutions from Project Drawdown. Project Drawdown has over 100 solutions that are just fascinating, like biochar solutions, clean cook stoves, educating women and girls, reducing our food waste. Did you know that one of the biggest sources of emissions from the entire food industry is food waste? When it decays, it produces heat-trapping gases that, if it was its own country, would be the 4th largest in the world. We all know that eating more plants is better. Beef is a huge source of carbon emissions. So eating lower down the food chain is something that we can all do, but also reducing our food waste often surprises people. They don't know that that's a huge climate solution. I talk about climate solutions that stop carbon from going into the atmosphere, like efficiency and clean energy. Climate solutions that take carbon out of the atmosphere, not just tree planting, but climate smart agriculture as well. Climate solutions that help systems and communities in need, like greening low-income neighborhoods right here at home that can be up to 15 degrees hotter during a heat wave than a high-income neighborhood in the same city because of lack of green space. And climate solutions that help others through investing in drought-resistant agriculture. I love talking about climate solutions that give us cleaner air and water too, that protect us from disasters also, that improve our health as well, that provide more affordable energy, not less, that reduce our inequalities, that create healthy ecosystems and food systems, that give us that better world. Oh, and they fix climate change too. And then I love telling people who's on board. We've got entire countries on board. We've got cities on board all around the world. I was just in Houston talking with the mayor about their very ambitious climate action plan. We've got companies on board, many companies. We've got universities and seminaries on board, even the Anabaptists. We've got churches on board of all kinds. The Pope, the Patriarch Bartholomew, the Archbishop of Canterbury, obviously, the Episcopal Church, your own. We've got young people, mothers, senior citizens, grandparents. We've got people all around the world who are passionate about climate action because of who they already are. They understand that makes them the perfect person to care. So when we start looking around, we can see that giant boulder of climate action. It's not sitting at the bottom of the hill with only a few hands on it. And if I add mine, it won't budge. That giant boulder is already at the top of the hill. It's already rolling down the hill in the right direction. It already has millions of hands on it. And if we use our voice to encourage others to add their hands too, along with ours, it will go faster. That is efficacy. That is hope. So once again, it's not about saving the planet as if it's the planet versus people or the economy versus the environment. It is quite literally about saving us living beings, humans, plants, animals, all of us on this planet. That is what it is about. And that's why every single one of us is the perfect person to care about climate change and to support climate action. And that's why when I wrote my book last year, I called it Saving Us, not saving the planet, because we are the ones who are at stake, but we are the ones who can actually do something about it. And if that isn't hope, I don't know what is. So I want to end with one of my favorite verses. And it's this: the only thing that counts is when our faith expresses itself through love. Love for our sisters and our brothers, and love for God's creation around the world. And if that's the case, then what are we waiting for? Thank you.
Oh, Joanne, you're muted right now. But thank you so much, Katharine. That was a wonderful presentation.
And you'd think by this the point in the Zoom cycle, I'd be able to put the mute off. Susie, why don't you go ahead, because your first question that you were thinking about was the response to Katharine's book.
Yeah. So, I mean, I know a lot of people who are joining us today have had the pleasure of reading your book, and I know it's been a part of many book clubs and things for environmentalists and for people of faith alike, and for, of course, that very important intersection. Because it came out in 2021, I suppose, what kind of things have you seen change, or that may have been leading us in the direction of actually getting us to the saving us aspect of your book since its original publication?
That is a great question. And since then, I have seen two trends. And I would add to, I've been putting some resources in the chat if anyone's interested in following up on more. So the first trend I've seen is a negative trend. Since I published my book, I have seen the huge emergence of what I call Dumerism. In other words, people who are so worried, they're stuck in that big middle category, people who are so worried but don't see anything that they can do, that they descend into Dumerism as a self-defense mechanism. They basically say, okay, there's nothing we can do. There's absolutely nothing. And so they get on social media, or they engage with people they know with the approach almost of an evangelist, but they're trying to convince people that there's nothing they can do. So a few months ago, I received a heartbreaking message on Instagram that sort of embodied this. A woman wrote to me and she said, I have a friend who is completely convinced there's nothing we can do about climate change. And she's so convinced about it that she ridicules and makes fun of anyone who's engaging in climate action. And she is convincing her children that it's all over. And she said, what can I do? And this is just heartbreaking, because you know where this person comes from. They come from a sense of intense worry and concern over very valid facts, but they have no sense of efficacy. And so because they don't think there's anything they can do, they want to convince everybody else that there's nothing they can do to validate the fact that they've given up. And what does that mean? It means that if we decide we're doomed, we are. If we decide there's nothing we can do, we will do nothing. And what will happen? The worst case scenario will happen. So that is why it is so important to fight for what I call rational hope. Not, the hope where you bury your head in the sand and you say, everything's going to be okay. It is not going to be okay, especially not if we bury our heads. But if we do everything we can, here is what the science says. This is literally a quote from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Every action matters. Every bit of warming matters. Every choice matters. That means our future is truly in our hands, and what we do matters. So that is the first trend I've seen, is a trend towards Dumerism. And when people come at me on social media saying, a man just said to me the other day, when are you going to tell the truth? I said, well, what do you mean by that? Because there's a few things he could mean by that. And he said, well, when are you going to tell people it's all over? And I said, I will tell them that when it is all over. But until then, I will fight my hardest for a livable future for my child and for everyone else's on this planet. But the second trend I've seen since the book came out is much more positive. Awareness of and concern over and support for solutions to climate change are just skyrocketing, not just in the US, but around the world. So a year ago, exactly a year ago, Earth Day last year, I started a newsletter. And it's been a year since my newsletter's been coming out every week. And I started this newsletter because people really were asking me, well, where do I find this good information? Where do I find positive things that are happening to share with people? So I said, all right, I'm going to write a newsletter. Every week, I'm going to have a piece of good news, and it's going to be color-coded green. Then I'm going to have a piece of not so good news, color-coded red, so people can skip right over it if they need to. And some people do need to skip it because they're just so worried that they can't even look at the bad news. But I believe we do need to know what's happening to the world, how it's affecting things we care about. And then at the bottom, I'm going to have something in blue about what we can do to make a difference. And I was worried a year ago when I started this that I was going to run out of good news. But you know what I'm doing now? I'm like shoving 3 or 4 good news stories into a single newsletter now because there's so much happening around the world. So if you're interested, actually, let me just share my screen again one more time. And if you have your phone with you, you can take out your phone. This is what my newsletter looks like. It comes out every week on Thursdays. It's totally free, and we don't share anybody's email address for any reason. And like I said, there's good news, not so good news, and something you can do every week. So just take a picture of the QR code with your phone, or you can just go to my website, which I put in the chat right there. Click on my website, which is my name, katharineHayhoe.com. You can sign up for the newsletter, and you will hear about the latest trends and good news every week.
And I can tell you it's wonderful. I'm a subscriber, and I really appreciate that balance of what are positive developments that are occurring and then the bad news. Because obviously, if you are objective about what's happening, it's not all good news. When we announced that we were having this webinar, a number of participants, and some folks have put this in the Q&A, were particularly interested in what's the role of church endowment investments. What role can they play in terms of taking advantages of the opportunities? You, for example, talked about investing in regenerative agriculture, or on the flip side, looking at the systemic risks to position things to avoid risks. But I think this particular individual was very interested in your sense of the fossil fuel divestment effort, and whether that's something to be encouraged, whether you think that's productive. I know that's a gigantic question, but how do investments fit in? And many of, particularly at the Episcopal Parish Network, many of our churches do have endowments. How does that fit into the picture?
Mm-hmm. So the idea of divestment is one that was pioneered by Bill McKibben, who many of you will be familiar with. And it's the idea of looking at where our money is. And this applies to endowments for churches or for universities or for foundations. It also applies to us as individuals. Who do we bank with? Where do our credit cards come from? I found out a couple of years ago that we had a credit card from the number one biggest fossil fuel supporting bank. So not only did I cancel it, but I called them up and told them why. And they said, well, all the banks support fossil fuels. And I said, well, that may be the case, but you're number one. And so that's why I'm canceling my card. So this is a way to take action. And I have had so many amazing stories since Saving Us came out, but one of my favorite stories actually comes from Ireland, where I heard that in the Presbyterian Church in Ireland, in their annual meeting, they were discussing whether the church should divest from fossil fuels. And the proposal was presented by someone who stood up and quoted from my book. And the way they put this, I thought was so beautiful. They said, we do not only want to divest from fossil fuels, but we want to invest in the lives of people who are, first of all, depending on the fossil fuel industry for their income. And I'm not talking about, the CEOs with their 8-figure salaries and bonuses. I'm talking about the coal miners, the people who work in the oil and gas fields, the people who just want to put food on the table for their family. So they said, we're going to invest in the lives of people. That's called a just transition. And also we can invest in what would accelerate the transition: energy efficiency programs in low-income neighborhoods, helping to transition to clean energy in those neighborhoods, or public transportation, or solutions that would actually help people towards a better life. So when we pair those both, divesting and investing in, I think it's a wonderful way to express climate action. Now, I do want to put a small caveat on that, and that is the fact that some people, if they have the means to do so, and I can assure you I as an individual do not have these means, but if they have the means to do so, some investors have been actually getting together, and there's a program called Engine Number One that's been doing this with Exxon, and they've been buying up shares in the company, and they're doing it so they can show up at the annual meeting and force them to adopt climate resolutions. So that is the opposite of divesting. It's investing specifically to effect change from inside. And I think that is also a great thing to do. So the real issue is not exactly what we do, but why are we doing it? What do we hope to accomplish from our actions? So there's no one size fits all. There are a whole variety of solutions, and each one is best suited for a specific situation, depending on what you're able to do with it and what you're able to accomplish.
That's great. I think, yeah, there's, the question of where the money goes is always an important one. I suppose as a person who works in the federal advocacy space and, talking about and public policy in general, I've noticed a few mentions in the chat of the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act and the Green New Deal and all those types of legislation. How important do you see the kind of federal legislation, the state level legislations, the local legislation involved in this, and how do you see the advocacy side and the involvement in that space as constituents to be like a really crucial part to this? Like, how do you engage with legislators about climate change and that type of thing?
Well, all of the above. And by the way, I love all the great comments that are going on in the chat. There's so many great suggestions and resources there. They're just phenomenal. So thank you, everybody who's putting in there. Often, we just jump immediately when we're thinking about advocacy to the federal level. But what surprised me, full disclosure, I am a Canadian, so I don't vote in the United States, but reading a lot about social change, what surprised me is the fact that less than 0.5% of elected officials in the United States are federal officials. The vast majority, well over 99% of elected officials, are not federal. County, state, school board, city, and significant changes can happen there. So even under the Trump administration, there was a program called We're Still In. And so many cities, states, businesses, universities, faith groups had signed that we are still in on the Paris Agreement statement that over 60% of US emissions were represented by entities who had the ability to influence their own emissions and had made the decision to do so. So do not underestimate the role that cities can play, or that companies can play, or that education can play in investing in local school boards, and of course that states can play as well. But where does the federal government come in? It comes in as an accelerator. So I mentioned that I was just in Houston this past week speaking with the mayor. Mayor Sylvester Turnell is a huge supporter of climate action. The city of Houston, home to the oil and gas industry, also one of the most vulnerable cities to climate impacts, from flooding, from heat, and from hurricanes and sea level rise. So for years, he has been working on climate solutions in Houston that address issues of justice, inequity, vulnerability, and resilience. But what he had to say was this: finally, thanks to the the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act, finally the city has more resources to do what they already wanted to do. So in other words, they had all these plans, they had the resources to do this much, and then along comes the federal support and they can do this much more. So it really is a symbiotic relationship, and we need those changes at every level, because imagine if the city of Houston didn't have a climate action plan. Then the IRA funds wouldn't help. Why do they have a climate action plan? Because people in Houston voted for a climate mayor. So at every level, we need that action and engagement. At the level of a church, a university, a school, a place of work or business, a community organization like the Rotary Club, as well as the city, the county, and the state. Every bit matters, and it all adds up.
And I'm sorry, there have been several requests for you to put the QR code back up for your newsletter, if you wouldn't mind, while Joanne asks you the next question.
I absolutely can do that. And just FYI, if you go to my website, which is just, I'll put my website in here again, you can also sign up there.
So a participant has asked about corporations, and as I touched on at the very beginning in terms of Church Investment Group's work, we're looking at doing environmental social governance, and it's very much the philosophy and I think the practical impact of corporations are an enormous part of our economy. If we can impact them, we can help be part of the solution. Katharine also touched on, with engine number one, direct lobbying, and there's a challenge that we're a member of the Interfaith Center on Corporate Responsibility, that we're finding corporations are saying one thing publicly and then giving money to the Better Business Bureau to go in the opposite direction. So this is sort of a combination of corporations and a personal question. Mm-hmm. Exxon did the original research on climate change. Is it your sense that those executives just don't think it's happening, not happening fast, don't have grandchildren? How, and you're in Texas, how do you see that play between the oil and gas industry and the anti-ESG pushback that's now occurring? And I know that was a very multi-pronged question.
It was, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back to a slide that I was showing before because the answer truly is there. Oil and gas executives, and coal executives too, of course, are suffering from a significantly enhanced version of the same problem that we all humans have. They still see it as, oh, well, that's not going to affect me. It's going to affect those poor people who live over there, or plants and animals, or people who live on low-lying islands, but we'll just move inland, we'll be okay. So first of all, they are definitely suffering from psychological distance, and to a certain extent, they're correct, because to a certain extent, the wealthier you are, the more insulated you are from climate impacts, to a certain extent. When things start to break down, when systems start to break down, when there's no water coming out of the tap, that's that. But for now, it is true that the more money you have, the more resilience you can buy. But the second thing they're suffering from is solution aversion. So they are tied as a publicly traded company to quarterly and annual returns. This past year, the fossil fuel industry, Saudi Aramco, BP, Shell, Exxon, they made the most money this past year that they've ever made, ever. And what did they do? BP slashed, or no, was it Shell? Shell slashed their climate goals in half. Or was it BP? One of them slashed their climate goals in half, and then the other one canned their green biofuels program. So they are just not even built to consider the fact that there's no profit on a dead planet. That if they looked at their 10-year returns, they're going to end up with massive stranded assets. The whole economy is built on the premise that there's always more to go in and there's always somewhere to put what goes out. And the reality is we live on a circular planet, not a flat one. We have to transition to a circular economy. And that means that we can no longer be doing business the way that we've been doing it. And if they aren't going to change, they're ultimately going to pay the price. But the problem is it's not just them, it's us who are paying the price of those decisions. So that's why we need policy. That's why we need legislation. So somebody commented in the chat, well, instead of this, what about that? It's not a this or that. It's all of the above. There's no A, B, C, D, E, F, G, pick one. This is the best solution. No, the answer is Z, all of the above. We need consumer behavior changes. We need investment changes. We need policies at every level. We need people engaged in every organization using their voices to advocate for change. We need every type of solution we can that makes the problem better, not worse. And that includes efficiency. It includes clean energy. It includes behavioral changes. It includes, again, financial changes and policy changes. It includes agricultural changes, how we use our land, how we grow our food, how we invest in and restore nature, because nature can take up some of our carbon emissions too. Up to a third of it can be taken up by nature. All of the above is what we need. So there's no silver bullet, but the good news is there's a lot of silver buckshot.
I like that metaphor. I will say one of the most egregious things I've seen recently was an advertisement from BP claiming how they're on the track to electrify all of their oil drilling sites, as if that's progress. It's interesting to see how they change tactics in a more climate conscious world, for sure. My next question, I guess, goes back a little bit more to the spiritual side of all of your work and this work in general. And that's how does the church do more to speak to like the heart aspect of what you've been talking about? And how important do you believe the ritual, the spiritual practice, prayer, and those types of practices are to engagement within our ecosystems and with creation care and all of those things responding to the climate crisis?
And can I just tag on, because that was a specific question. Have you found that the heart approach, the spiritual approach, is more effective than our temperature is increasing and we have fires and the environmental approach?
Absolutely. Almost everyone who's going to be convinced by the environmental approach is already convinced. But here's the thing. If they were convinced by the environmental approach, then they think everybody else could be too. And so that's why we have that cycle where people load up on more doom-filled facts, and then they get frustrated when people just pull the blankets up over their head and inaction continues. We want everybody to be the same as us, but that isn't the way it works. We have to meet people where they are, not where we want them to be. So we have to figure out what's in their hearts. And for those of us who are people of faith, a large part of what is in our hearts is based on what we believe. Now, I want to caution that in the United States, religious labels have become political labels. 40% of people in the United States who self-identify as evangelicals don't go to church. Their statement of faith is not written by the Bible, it's written by their political ideology. So when I approach someone who identifies as an evangelical, and this just happened the other day, a woman on Twitter said something really horrible to me, and her profile was all Bible verses. And so I said, well, in case you're not aware, I am a Christian. I'm a pastor's wife. I'm a Christ follower. In fact, that's why I am a climate scientist, is because I'm a Christian. I was planning to be an astrophysicist until I found out how climate change affects those who are most vulnerable. And I said, would you like to, just letting you know that this is where I come from, and this, if you want to know more. And I gave her a link to a talk I'd given at Southeastern Baptist Seminary. And her response was, which? So clearly, I don't think that her statement of faith is written by the Bible. So just to caution there, and it's not just evangelicals. White Catholics are most likely to reject the reality of a changing climate, whereas Hispanic Catholics are most likely to accept it. That's nothing to do with the Pope. It's got everything to do with their politics. So leaving that aside, in that case, we have to find out what it is they really do care about and don't assume it's the Bible. Those of us who truly do take our faith seriously as expressed in our lives, it is a great place to start with our shared faith. Because the closer to our heart, whatever it is that we begin with is, the more deeply it will reach. So when we connect to somebody over a shared love of, beach vacations, that's nice. But when we connect over a shared love for our children or grandchildren, that's a whole level deeper, right? And when we connect over something that is fundamental to our identity, who we are as a child of God, well, that's about as deep as it can go. So I absolutely agree that that's a tremendous place to start. And we have so much to say about our God-given responsibility, about God's care and love for every aspect of his creation, about how we're to care for others who are less fortunate than ourselves, all the way to the end of the Bible where it says God will destroy those who destroy the earth. We have a whole Bible full of verses that we can pull from to show why climate action truly is something that, again, if we took the Bible seriously, we'd be out at the front of the line demanding action on that. And I know that many of you already are.
So alas, we are coming down to the end of our hour, and we could go on and on because Katharine is such a knowledgeable scientist and at the convergence of science, action, and faith. And that's a rare and blessed combination. Just to finish up for folks, are there particular resources that you would, beyond your good news, bad news, that you'd like to point people to think about steps that they can take and that their churches can take?
Yes. So I just answered a question very briefly in the chat that was about what do we do when people are just interested in pointing fingers and guilting each other? That's a fear-based reaction. When we try to control other people's behavior and judge them, we're trying to make ourselves feel better at their expense. That is the opposite of love. So I had a little Twitter thread on that I put in the chat if anybody's interested. But in terms of resources, I would encourage people to go to my website. I have a frequently asked questions page. And on the frequently asked questions page, I have a question about what can my church do? And I've just collected a bunch of resources of other people who are doing things, and I've sort of shared them, like, here you go, check out these resources. There's so many amazing ideas. Some of them might not be perfect for your church. So for example, I was asked the other day, has your church divested? And if you're familiar with evangelical churches, you understand why I just laughed, because there is no endowment. It is week to week. Whatever is in the collection plate, that gets used, parceled out, given to whatever, missions that we support and pay out people's salaries. There is zero endowment. So that doesn't work for the type of church I attend. But there's lots of other things that do work, like putting solar panels on the roof, offering those as a community solar garden to your neighbors to help them also invest in the clean energy. Teaching and talking about it, modeling it through what you do. There's so many things churches can do. So I'd encourage you to check out my website. Also, you can follow me on social media. all different channels. It's all on my website also. I have a little series called Global Weirding of videos, and one of the most popular videos is What Does the Bible Say About Climate Change? I'll put the link to that in the chat too. And then I have my TED Talk and my book that you can find at your local library. You can buy for your church's library. You can listen to as an audiobook. And don't forget my newsletter as well. So many ways to hear the good news of what climate action looks like.
Well, we have hit 4 o'clock. I'm sorry to have to close this conversation, but I'm very, very grateful for you all attending and for Katharine making time in her very, very busy schedule to share both heart and action with us. It's really been a pleasure to be with you all this afternoon. People are asking about this. It has been recorded, and Episcopal Parish Network will make a distribution of it. So you'll be able to get access to the recording. So thank you for joining us. Thank you, Katharine, for sharing your wisdom and experience. And thank you for writing Saving Us and to direct us to steps we can take.
Thank you.